The following program, President Grant, His Reflections, is a presentation of the Civil War Broadcasting Network. It is one of that series of programs wherein President Grant shares his reflections of persons, places, or events in his presidency or his life after the presidency. It is available on the free YouTube channel, General Grant by himself, or Dr. E.C. Fields. Please subscribe. It is free. And on Facebook under President Grant by himself, or Kurt Fields as General Ulysses S. Grant, and other social media. Permission to copy and distribute is granted, and indeed is encouraged. Remember that you are the future of our past. And now, President Grant reflects on his first campaign for the presidency. I'm President Ulysses S. Grant, and I am pleased that you have seen fit to join me here in the parlor this day while I think back about my run for the presidency, what led up to it, and being elected the 18th President of the United States. It goes back to the 4-year period between President Lincoln's murder and my election in November 3rd of 1868. President Andrew Johnson ascended after President Lincoln was murdered, and unfortunately promptly grew to be at cross purposes with Congress. He wanted to distill the issue to its essence. President Johnson wanted Reconstruction to be such that the white society aristocracy was destroyed and the common man lifted and did not care for the rights of the freed Negroes. Congress and the radical Republicans wanted the South punished and wanted to do away with the leadership and remake the seceding states back into what they felt would be acceptable in rejoining the Union. Now, the legislation was passed that divided the 11 Confederate states into 5 military districts, with military leadership overseeing the civilian population, which was supposed to be busily rewriting constitutions that did away with slavery, ensured the rights of the newly freed 4 million Negroes, and to mold those states into what the radical Republicans thought that a good state should be. At the same time, President Johnson was maintaining that that did not have to happen, that the states had never really seceded. Therefore, they didn't need to rewrite constitutions, and they did need to reconstitute their legislatures, and to pretty much maintain as they were before the war. And of course, that was unacceptable to Congress. And Johnson, furthermore, became at even deeper cross purposes, irreconcilably so, when he began vetoing the civil rights legislation and the laws that the radical Congress was passing, and Johnson vetoing them and Congress passing over his vetoes routinely. And it came to a head when the Tenure of Office Act was passed and President Johnson wanted to dismiss Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, and did, and that of course was what Congress was waiting for, and the battle began. They said Stanton couldn't be removed because of the Tenure of Office Act, which turned out to be unconstitutional, which it was, but it was the law of the land at the time. And in removing Stanton from office, President Johnson had me become the Secretary of War ad interim. And for myself and my relationship with President Johnson, it rapidly degraded from there. I did not want to be the Secretary of War. I did not want to be a politician, and I did not want to be in between the President and the Congress with the flames ever getting higher. President Johnson talked with me, and I vigorously tried to get out of it, and nevertheless was hung with it. I did tell him that I would hold it only until the issue was resolved, or if the Senate were to pass the legislation or make the approval move that said it was the law, which they did. And in, as I recall, January of 1868, the Senate Military Affairs Committee recommended to the full Senate that the Tenure of Office Act was legitimate and that Stanton should stay. When I saw or learned of that, I went back just to satisfy myself and reviewed the Tenure of Office Act. And to my horror, because I really hadn't read it before then, I didn't need to. I didn't think it was going to come to that. And I saw that if I were not to relinquish the keys, actually the keys to the door of the Secretary of War's office, then I would be liable to a fine of $10,000 and 5 years in prison, or both. So I went back to the War Department the next day, locked the doors, and gave the keys to Army Adjutant General, and told him I'll be in my office in the headquarters, Army headquarters across the street. I didn't think that Stanton would move so quickly, yet he did, and within an hour he's back in conducting business as usual. And actually he summoned me over and was very brusque with me, very approaching, hostile. His same old usual self, which once I got over the shock that he wasn't grateful for what I had done, particularly culminating in stepping aside and giving him, the, so to speak, the keys back to the office, I was reminded that his personality was such that did not endear him to anyone. And it was also such that he didn't care. President Johnson called me over to his office and berated me and asked me why I had done that. You betrayed me. And I wrote him a letter in reply. I told him that I did not betray him. Went back to my office and wrote several letters in a series back and forth, and told him I didn't betray him. I did what I told him I was going to do from the beginning. And then again, he relieved Stanton, and ultimately General John Schofield was put in Stanton's place. Stanton finally gave up the office ghost and stepped aside. But the next day, President Johnson, after he had berated me in his office, invited me to a cabinet meeting, and in that cabinet meeting he addressed me as Secretary of War. Now, in the beginning of all this furor, I had told the President, I am not a politician. I do not want to go to the cabinet meetings, and if I do, only to present the military portion of the business in my portfolio and then leave. And that was all right for the most part, to an extent. But this meeting, when I corrected him and said I am no longer Secretary of War ad interim, he laid into me about my integrity and my character, and became vicious. Whereupon I stood up and said, "You're attacking my character, you are attacking my personal integrity, and I will have none of it, sir. May I be excused?" And before he could reply, I was on my way to the door, firmly closing it behind me. Well, that was the end of any relationship I had with the President. But the impeachment committee members who'd been bubbling about impeaching him, when they got wind of those letters we had written back and forth, the chair of that committee felt that that was all he needed to charge the president with misdemeanor, high crimes, and so forth, and they began the impeachment process. Well, during the impeachment process that spring, the Republican Party, they dropped the National Union. Now they're just the Republican Party. Met in May 20th, I believe it was, in Chicago at the Crosby Opera House. On that day, there were 8,000 people to attend the opening of the Republican convention. One of them was my father, Jesse Grant. He didn't realize it, but he was cordoned off by several people who were assigned to stay with him and prevent him from saying anything to any journalist that we all might regret, and they were successful. Former General and to-be Senator Carl Schurz, a German immigrant, gave the introduction keynote speech, and the convention was open. General John Logan, who is now back in Congress, he'd been a congressman before the war, and in fact, back in June of '61, had been one of the two congressmen, the other being John McClernand, who spoke to my regiment, the 21st Illinois, and got the remaining 500 or 600. The others had all gone home when they weren't mustered in. But almost to a man, after John Logan and John McClernand spoke to them on my behalf, they enlisted for 3 years. Logan had been a congressman before the war in southeastern Illinois, in the area known as Egypt, and as had John McClernand. But Logan had become one of President Grant's political generals, and was, in my opinion, the best political general of them all out of the 178 that President Lincoln appointed. Logan, who was a civilian, rose to the occasion, had a natural military talent, to lead men, wounded several times during the war, and temporarily was in command of the Army of the Tennessee when James B. McPherson was killed in Atlanta, and was a good friend of mine and had done well. In fact, I've said several times he was the best political general that Lincoln appointed. And Logan made the nominating speech for me, and it was then they took a vote, and all 650 delegates, with no exceptions, voted to nominate me for the Republican ticket to be President of the United States. 650 delegates unanimously, first vote. I was pleased. Then on the fifth ballot, they picked Schuyler Colfax, who was Speaker of the House, and he became my running mate. And I was sent notification that I had been nominated, and actually I was sent notification by Edwin M. Stanton. I was not paying attention to any of this business working in my office. Stanton was by the telegraph in the War Department. When news came through that I had been nominated, Stanton personally, in an act I had never seen before nor since, came to my office and was actually out of breath from running up the steps as fast as he could. He was a portly gentleman, and out of breath and red-faced, and said, "You've been nominated to be the presidential candidate for the Republican Party." Adam Badeau was in the room as well and said that I showed absolutely no emotion, no indication at all that the news had any impact on me at all. Now, when Stanton left, I sent the chairman of the committee this statement. That day I sent them this: "I will endeavor in a very short time to write you a letter accepting the trust you have imposed upon me, expressing my gratitude for the confidence you have placed in me. I will now say but little orally, and that is to thank you for the unanimity with which you have selected me as a candidate for the presidential office." I can say in addition, I looked on during the progress of the proceedings at Chicago with a great deal of interest, and I am gratified with the harmony and unanimity which seem to have governed the deliberation of the convention. If chosen to fill the high office for which you have selected me, I will give to its duties the same energy, the same spirit, and the same will that I have given to the performance of all duties which have devolved upon me heretofore. Whether I shall be able to perform those duties to your entire satisfaction, time will determine. You have truly said in the course of your address that I shall have no policy of my own to interfere against the will of the people. Ulysses S. Grant, etc. The next day, after I had time to compose, and I am not a public speaker, nor do I intend to become one. I had to after my presidency and around the world tour for 2.5 years, but not during my campaign nor during my 2 administrations. After careful composition, I sent this to General Joseph R. Hawley, the chairman or the president of the convention. In formally accepting the nomination of the National Union Republican Convention of the 21st of May, it seems proper that some statement of views beyond the mere acceptance of the nomination should be expressed. The proceedings of the convention were marked with wisdom, moderation, and patriotism, and I believe expressed the feelings of the great mass of those who sustained the country through its recent trials. I endorse their resolutions. If elected to the office of President of the United States, it will be my endeavor to administer all the laws in good faith, with economy, and with the view of giving peace, quiet, and protection everywhere. In times like the present, it is impossible, or at least eminently improper, to lay down a policy to be adhered to, right or wrong, through an administration of 4 years. New political issues, not foreseen, are constantly arising. The views of the public on old laws are constantly changing, and a purely administrative officer should always be left free to execute the will of the people. I always have respected the will and always shall. Peace and universal prosperity, its sequence, with economy of administration, will lighten the burden of taxation while it constantly reduces the national debt. Let us have peace. Now, while I intended no great import to that last 3 words or 4 words, let us have peace, that became the battle cry for my campaign, such as it was. You see, I had no intention of campaigning, nor did I campaign. What I did was, in June, this was on May 29th when I accepted the nomination formally, I got on the cars with General Sheridan and General Sherman, and my second son, Buck, who was 15 at the time, and took off on a vacation across the Great Plains. And I wrote Julia a letter that said, I intend to get away from the rigors of the office and the what's gone on the past 2 years particularly, and I want to see the Great Plains while they are not despoiled, with the Native Americans out there and the great buffalo herds still roaming. I want to see the Great Plains and all they have to offer. And I had Sherman and Sheridan with me. We were great buddies and friends and had no end of joy in the cars going across the plains. And we were inspecting military forts installations as we went, even up into Colorado. Buck turned 16 while we were on the trip, and we had great fun. Now, there were also a number of journalists who were on other cars on the train, and they To my chagrin, but not my surprise, they hung on my every word. So the progress of our trip across the Great Plains daily were reported to the people of the country and apparently devoured all across the country. And on July 4th, the Democrats had opened their convention, and they nominated Horatio Seymour, former governor of New York, and for his vice president, Frank Blair, of the St. Louis Blair family. And Frank Blair had also been a general under my command. Both good men. Horatio Seymour had some negative issues. He was cast as an anti-war candidate. He had sent troops to Gettysburg, but he was also shown in a political cartoon drawn by my friend Thomas Nast, another German immigrant, as standing on the steps of City Hall in New York while the city was in flames from the draft riots in July of '63, right a few days after the Battle of Gettysburg, and addressing the people as my friends. Well, in that riot situation where scores of people, particularly blacks, were hanged from lampposts, burned alive, beaten to death, and the Irish were also hanged, burned alive, and beaten to death. We'll never know how many people died, the hundreds that were injured. To picture Governor Seymour standing on the steps amidst the chaos saying, "My friends, please refrain," and so forth, was not a good image for Seymour. Frank Blair was so radical and racist in what he was saying that the powers that be in the Democratic Party actually requested that he restrict his movements, particularly not to go into the border states, Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware, and Maryland, and because of the fear that he would inflame them to the point that they'd vote Republican instead of Democratic. So they campaigned. Horatio really campaigned, as did Frank. After I finished my 2 weeks or so, my lengthy trip out west, I went back to Galena and sat on my front porch and in my parlor, my study with the marble fireplace and the blue and gold trim and the ferns, and smoked my cigar, my pipe, and read the papers avidly. And I had John Rawlins, my Secretary of War, to handle the business of the Army in Washington City, dealing only with those issues that absolutely had to have my signature or my approval, and they were sent to me from Washington. And I stayed in Galena. Now, something that was niggling at me was that Sherman had not endorsed me. He hadn't opposed me either. His not endorsing me didn't hurt me politically. It disappointed me a bit. I was in hopes that he would endorse me. And his not endorsing me, while it didn't hurt me, didn't help me either. I went back to St. Louis to visit Whitehaven, or ostensibly to visit Whitehaven. We had bought it, and in fact, Julia was telling her father, assuring him that the fantasy that he still owned Whitehaven. He did not. I owned Whitehaven at that time. And Julia let him have his fantasy, and he was living with us. When the nomination came through, I should point this out, Julia held a levee at our home that evening with all of her friends invited, and it gave me great satisfaction to see a house full of people there on I Street. We lived on Minnesota Row, an area called Minnesota Row, on I Street in Washington, and Julia entertained her friends with her father standing next to her, and I was there shaking hands and saying thank you a great deal. But it gave me a great deal of satisfaction to see her father, the man who had said I was no good, ne'er do well, and would never amount to anything, and now I'm running for the presidency. It felt good. I took some personal profit in that. In Galena, though, I would go to the DeSoto Hotel, a 5-story hotel. It was built with 7 stories, but the top 2 burned and they never built them back, so now it's a 5-story hotel. And they had a telegraph office there and political machinery organization on the 2nd floor, and I would occasionally go by there to see what the news was. And I told Elihu Washburn, the congressman from Galena, who'd been my champion from the beginning of the war, one would never know that there was a great political campaign in progress unless one read the newspapers and saw of all of the events being held across the country. I stayed home, never made any public statements, and kept my silence. Occasionally people would come and speak with me and visit with them, but I made no public statements. I made no speeches. I stayed in Galena, happily stayed in Galena, keeping my finger on the pulse of the campaign. On election night, on November and also though I need to add, the issue of the Jews came up, order number 11 from December of '62. There was a great deal of consternation about the Jewish vote, and I apologized for that. I wrote a letter to Senator Isaac Newton Morris of Quincy, Illinois, or Lawyer Morris, not senator. His father had been a senator. But to Isaac Morris, I told him I made that order. I sent it out promptly on the telegraph without reflection and without thought. And if I had done either, I wouldn't have sent that order out. I was angry when I sent it. It does not indicate my attitude toward Jews. And I sent the same letter to other Jews in the country. Obviously, they were concerned. And in the letter to Isaac and to the others, I said, I have no problems whatever with Jews as a people, as a sect. I did have problems back in '62 with specific individuals who were violating trade agreements, indeed dealing with the rebels and benefiting them. The order I issued does not indicate my feelings about Jews, and I know that this statement, that order does not sustain this statement that I don't have a problem with Jews. But then again, I don't sustain that order. I regret and always shall regret having issued order number 11, expelling the Jews from my military territory as a class. I won over the Jewish vote, and I think I got most of them after I'd assured them my true feelings. And I merely said, I made a mistake. I made a bad mistake, and I'm sorry. I acted precipitately and in anger. And I think I convinced the Jewish population of that. Well, on November 3rd, the election day, I went over to Elihu Washburn's home. He had a telegraph installed in his parlor, and actually was observing a card game. And again, Adam Badeau said, I was more interested in the card game than in the game that was being played out across the country. And the results began to come in. And I had made predictions. In fact, I'd written down predictions of who would carry what state. And I was accurate, I believe, without exception. As the results were coming in and the election was called either for Seymour or for Grant, I was correct, I believe, in every instance. Adam Badeau said it was astonishing how calm and cool I was throughout the process, and yet I had written down and predicted with prescience, almost as a seer, how the election would go. At about 2 o'clock in the morning, it was called, and my friends felt they were safe in telling me that I was now the next president of the United States. And I walked back with all that entourage back to my home, the home on the hill there in Quincy, in Galena, that I'd been given, 5-bedroom, 2-story, 3,500 square foot brick, state-of-the-art home. It is still there, and you may visit it in Galena. And I walked up to the door, and Julia had many of her friends there as well. And she said, "Well, Mother, I have been elected." And some say I said it almost mournfully. Perhaps so. I had an idea of what lay ahead of me. I had no idea the actuality, but the ominous shadow, the weight, was, I think, visible to me a bit. And I was the president. There was some celebration, low-key, and then I began to prepare to go back to Washington City to be elected president. I'd also like to add that during the campaign biography by Albert D. Richardson was written, and as you can see, it's been well used. But this is the book, or a copy of the book that Mr. Richardson wrote, and I was pleased with it. For the most part, it was very readable. I didn't think my life rated that much writing, but it's by Albert D. Richardson, titled "A Personal History of Ulysses S. Grant," engraved with 26 illustrations with a portrait and sketch of the Schuyler Colfax, etc., by Albert D. Richardson. And this came out in 1868. It was written during the campaign. And when I took the oath of office on March the 4th of 1869, I took it on this Bible, which is the Annotated Paragraph Bible. And it's published by the official title is the Annotated Paragraph Bible, Old and New Testaments, Explanatory Notes, published by in London by the Religious Tract Society. And I had my right hand on the 121st Psalm, which begins with, "I will lift up mine eyes unto the hills, from whence cometh my help." And this is a copy of that Bible. It's the only Bible, I should point out to you, that is not in the Museum of Bibles upon which presidents have taken their oaths. It was a personal gift from Chief Justice Salmon P. Chase to Julia at the last moment, and Julia kept it. And I was president. I would also point out in my closing thoughts, President Johnson thought he had really insulted me. He refused to ride to the inauguration in the carriage with me, as was traditional, and thought he would insult me. He did not. I had already made it clear I wasn't going to ride in the carriage with him. So his not even attending the inauguration, not only was it not an insult, it was a joy to find that out. I'd also tell you that my father, Jesse Grant, attended the inauguration. My mother did not. In fact, for my second inauguration, my father was in attendance. My mother was not. My mother, Hannah Grant, never came to Washington City, not for either one of my inaugurations. My father came frequently to the White House, but he stayed in the Willard Hotel. He refused to sleep in the White House because at this time, Colonel Dent, who had suffered a serious debilitating stroke back before the campaign began, back in the spring, Colonel Dent had moved into the White House and was in fact living there when he died in 1873. So again, the man who said about me I would never amount to anything and I wasn't good enough for his daughter, he wound up living in the White House while I am president, and in fact dying there. But because Colonel Dent was living in the White House, my father, Jesse Grant, refused to sleep in the White House and was reluctant to even take a meal, and would grind his teeth to have to even sit at the table with Colonel Dent. But with those thoughts, I believe I have said enough to address the matter of my running for the presidency for the first time in 1868 to be elected November 30th. Oh, I almost forgot. I won 53% of the popular vote. I got 3.1 million votes cast, and Seymour got 2.7 million votes cast, giving me 53% of the popular vote. In the Electoral College, I got 73% of the vote. I wound up with the final tally was 214 electoral votes to Seymour's 80. A pivotal factor of which I am mindful and should like to lift up to you is that in the South, in those 5 military districts, Negroes had been enfranchised in most places and could vote. I'm told that 400,000 black votes were cast. There weren't many votes cast north of the Mason-Dixon line because in the north, Negroes weren't allowed to vote. In the South, under military rule, they were allowed to vote. And 400,000 or so voted. I won the popular vote by 300,000 votes. A slim margin, but there are those who say I owed my election to the newly enfranchised slaves, newly freed and enfranchised slaves. And I'm not unmindful of that. In fact, I was pleased because their welfare and the defending of their equality and their rights are important to me. Having caught myself before I brought our meeting to a close to talk about that important segment of the vote, I think that I have indeed said enough to address the issue of my first race or campaign, or lack thereof, for the presidency. I hope you see fit to join me again when I talk about other matters of my presidency, but for the moment, I must bid you from the parlor a fond adieu. I'm President Ulysses S. Grant, for the moment, saying goodbye.